Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Alongside Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur for the inaugural edition of Protected Speech, our new program where we're going to talk about all kinds of things, namely the coverage that both of us do. We're both, decades into our journalism careers, respectively. We've taken some interesting paths, starting off in traditional media and then venturing off into new worlds. And we're going to talk about that here during this inaugural episode, and then get into a whole bunch of other topics, stories that we've personally covered, as well as things going on domestically and frankly globally. So Jonathan, thank you for doing this. We've been frankly talking about doing a show for, I don't even remember, many years, but here we are.
Yeah, we're finally here. We're talking to each other, and I love the name, man. Protected Speech. That's what this is going to be all about, right? We're just going to not only spitball, but talk the facts and talk about the hard truths and the inconvenient truths and a whole bunch of different perspectives you're not going to be getting in the mainstream media.
That is for sure. And, this program is really about talking about subjects that, frankly, other broadcasters may not have the stomach to talk about. Let's face it, we've both worked for major news operations, myself in California and Tennessee and Oregon. I've lived all over the country. Jonathan's been all over the place as well. And oftentimes you get 1, 2, 3 minutes to talk about a story. And let's face it, it's generally not enough.
Yeah. And I guess for the next hour, we're going to be talking about a lot of topics, stories that we are currently covering, stories that are still in play right now, not only locally, but nationally and also globally. And I think that global focus on, what's happening in China and India, rest of Asia, Africa, just all over the world. I think that global perspective through our lens, through our storytelling and our discussion here, I think is something I'm really looking forward to as well.
I want to get into some of the stories that we've been covering of late. And this is really, I think, where the show is going to go, is the original reporting. I think that's what makes this particular program what we hope to be is essential, because we do break stories on a regular basis. And I guess the first thing I want to discuss that I haven't told really anybody, unless you watch the network that we've built called Diya TV, is we had a chance to sit down with President Trump. Now it's been about a month, but we sat down with President Trump in Bedminster, New Jersey. It was kind of hard for me to believe, because obviously he's not in office now, but certainly the rumblings have been going on for a few months that he is planning a 2024 run. And you just don't know what everyone's thinking. Certainly the way he left office caused a whole lot of controversy. But he's continuing to, in a sense, campaign for 2024. He's doing events on a regular basis. And so I had a chance to get out to Bedminster. I didn't know if it was going to materialize, but it actually did. And we had a chance to talk about a couple of topics, one of them being on, AAPI hate crimes, which no one, to my knowledge, has had a discussion with him. We've had a spate of hate crimes. And that's going to be one part of this show, is we're going to actually have a segment focused in on the spate of hate crimes going on, affecting Asian Americans around this country. We have obviously close friends of ours that have been covering this beat for the better part of a year or two now during the pandemic. But I think Jonathan and I really wanted to discuss this, because we are covering it in our newscasts on a regular basis on our network. But I think sometimes the context is lost, and frankly, we're not able to give the full picture. We just, unfortunately, are just giving stats of so-and-so was affected by a terrible incident. And I think we wanted to provide more color. But so we did talk to Trump about that. And then another issue being about the green card backlog and the real challenge that, Indian Americans, South Asians, and really a broader immigrant community faces, where we have, in the case of Indian Americans, like 250,000 children of legal immigrants cannot get their paperwork. And we're not even talking about folks that have come here without paperwork. That's a whole other topic. But there are all these nuances to immigration. And let's face it, if you're not in the middle of it, and I think it's been, I guess, a blessing to be born in this country, you don't think about it much unless you have friends, family directly affected by the immigration challenges. But you have people that are here legally. You have people that are not here through legal means. And they both sides have challenges. And I think one of these aspects is what we've found out are these kids of legal immigrants that get here at 1, 2, 3 years old. They've been raised in this country for a couple decades, but at 21, if they don't have their paperwork straightened out, they have to self-deport. And it's been a really terrible tale for so many of these kids. And we had a chance to talk to some of them this summer. We sponsored an event called Indian American Impact, which is a political organization. That one's a Democratic-leaning organization. But this is a bipartisan issue, and that's why I think it's really important to, again, as Jonathan likes to do, hold political leaders accountable. That's what I'm here for as well. And whether that's Democrats or Republicans, we ultimately have to hold all these folks accountable. And so that's where, we sat down at Impact and had interviews with these kids affected, talking to the officials in Washington, but having a specific conversation with President Trump about these kids in limbo with their legal status. So that was another part of our conversation. And we'll break a little bit of news here since this is our first program. I did get a chance to talk to President Trump specifically about AAPI hate crimes and also the targeting of Hindu Americans, which is kind of a subsect that doesn't get discussed much, but we have heard about different communities. Obviously, we know the plight of the Jewish community historically. We've heard obviously the impact of 9/11 on Muslim Americans in this country, but certainly other groups are not discussed as much. And Hindu Americans have been targeted recently, and I think that's one of the focuses that we've been also trying to cover, because there's all these different narratives out there that certain communities have it worse off than others. And let's face it, I think because of COVID, and I'll let you jump in here before we show the clip, Jonathan. I mean, there are certain narratives that don't get out there, and I think that's why it's important that a news organization like ours gets out there and tries to showcase as much of it as possible.
Look, I've said this for years now. If the media, journalists don't cover something, it's almost like it never happened. And that's why so many Asian American, Indian American, South Asian communities have just been marginalized, because our stories and our narratives have not been covered or preserved. And it's had a trickle-down effect, especially in our public schools right now. And with this, our country continuing to change, becoming majority minority, at a certain point, this is the worst kept secret. But in mainstream media, when you hear pundits or other journalists or politicians talk about diversity, it's usually between the black and white narrative. That's diversity for the most part. That's like the lowest common denominator. But again, the fact of the matter is Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority group in America, the fastest growing minority bloc in the nation. And our stories matter. So I think when all is said and done, man, I think what we're going to hopefully do is capture these stories, cover these stories so they're preserved for the next generation, so they can be analyzed, so they can so people can go back and watch something again, read something again, to learn. Again, they say journalists, we're part of what? Crafting the first draft of history. So let's do that for this community, for our community.
So I want to take a moment here to play this clip. We haven't shown this anywhere else. This is we kind of saved it for this moment, knowing full well we're going to launch this particular broadcast. Yes, you can call it an exclusive. It is, because this is President Trump being asked specifically during my sit down with him about the impact of the rising tide of AAPI hate crimes and its impact. Let's take a look.
And finally, Asian Americans have been hit by hate crimes recently in the last couple of years, and especially now Hindu Americans. In recent weeks, we've had women targeted in Texas, men in California, now even in the UK. Do you have thoughts about the spate of hate crimes that Asian Americans and Hindu Americans are facing?
Well, I'm hearing about it, and it shouldn't happen, and we've got to stop it.
Hey, so, again, listening to the former president, it was really interesting to hear him talk about how this shouldn't be happening. But as you know, many of his critics claim that he sort of fueled the rise of Asian hate, especially, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, you remember President Trump calling COVID-19 Kung Flu, the China virus, referenced bat soup. Of course, COVID-19, as far as we know, the entire global medical community, at the very least, acknowledging it, that the origins of the virus came out of, China, and then, of course, spread across the nation, the world. First known case in the U.S. was actually in Kirkland, Washington, just 10 minutes away from where I live right now. So we all know what happened. But what were your thoughts on President Trump directly answering that question, really, from you?
Well, I mean, look, I think he said what was what needed to be said. I mean, don't forget, he is trying to appease voters at this point. I mean, going into meeting him, and this was, again, early September when we shot the interview, I didn't have any real sense that he was going to run for president specifically, but I certainly walked out of there thinking, oh, yeah, he's running in 2024. So, I mean, at this point, he's going to make the rounds like every other political leader that wants to get into office. And you're seeing that right now with the midterms. And we're going to talk about that as well. I think Trump is trying to play a role in these midterms and has. Obviously, he's holding rallies all over the country. And I think what's really interesting, and again, if you watch our coverage on a regular basis on the TV network that we run, Diya TV, then you've seen us cover President Trump and his effort to target Indian Americans. But if this is a new topic to you, I'll just kind of briefly explain, because Jonathan and I have been involved in this coverage, and it goes back to even back to 2019 in the middle of his presidency. But, Trump was the first, federal candidate, first presidential candidate to have a rally targeting the Indian American community. And it never happened before. You'd have, photo ops. And I remember uncles of mine with photo ops with George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton. They're very proudly putting up that photo that they probably paid, $1,000 for to get that photo on the mantelpiece, right? That was really common. I saw that in many communities. But this was the first time where you had 5,000 people show up in New Jersey at a specific rally for the Indian American community. And if to give some more context, it was held on literally the weekend of that Access Hollywood tape coming out, which was really the nadir of his 2016 campaign. I mean, let's face it, most of his advisors, I think maybe with the exception of Steve Bannon, told him to pull out. And Bannon was the only person who thought they could ride the storm, and certainly they did. But the community, at least the one gentleman that stuck with President Trump at that time, was this guy, Shali Kumar, who founded the Republican Hindu Coalition. And because of that, they are still friends, and they didn't have as much of an alliance in 2020 because there were other advisors in the mix thinking they should have a different approach. But in 2016, Shali went to different Hindu temples around the country, specifically in swing states, and convinced a great many of them to switch their vote for Trump. And that was, according to the data that the RHC has provided us, enough margin for Trump to get over the hump. I mean, don't forget, both of these races in 2016 and 2020 were decided on the margins. 10 or 20,000 votes here or there in a swing state, brings all those electoral college votes to one of those candidates. And so this is what they're banking on, I believe, in 2024. And this is why President Trump is already doing a full court press, doing these rallies around the country that obviously certain partisan networks are out there showcasing on a regular basis. But the fact that Trump is now doing specific outreach, and obviously we get leads and tips from different groups, already there are efforts to do multiple events here before the midterms to get Indian American voters in the fray. So, and again, to bring some more context, Jonathan saw firsthand. We did a live broadcast back in 2019 when there was a Howdy Modi event, which was the Prime Minister of India having quite literally a political rally in Houston, Texas, unlike anything I've seen before. 50,000 people at one football stadium in Houston. And Jonathan was there with us to help cover that thing. And it was quite a spectacle with President Trump, a sitting president, with the sitting Prime Minister of India, having this very transparent political rally in Houston for all to see.
So, look, here's what I want to know, and I guess we'll have to wait and see. But once again, despite all the accomplishments of Asian Americans, as I mentioned, fastest growing minority group in America, fastest growing voting bloc, minority voting bloc in America, do you feel like the Asian American vote will finally matter? Because by all accounts right now, you hear murmurs here and there of, Republicans, trying to somehow galvanize, in a very specific community, the Asian American community, and say, come along to our side. Frankly, the Democrats and the Republicans have done such a poor job taking for granted this important community, this voting bloc. Do you feel like this year it's going to be any different, or are we going to see the same?
Frankly, I think I see similar approaches. I think in 2020, the GOP took a more traditional approach to AAPI communities, and I think that got a lot of criticism from some of the advisors that talk to me and say, what
does that mean? Just like not doing anything and
it's kind of like
they're not going to vote Republican or assuming they're going to vote Democrat, because traditionally Asian Americans have, but that's changing.
Right. I think what I heard, again, 2016, Trump did specific outreach to Indian Americans and Hindu Americans. In 2020, they didn't have that same kind of targeted approach. And so AAPI communities were just kind of, okay, maybe we have a Korean guy, we have a Chinese person, we have an Indian person, whatever it was. But there was no specific Indian event that I recall. And I talked to the kind of Trump advisors there. And so, it was just different. And I think this is why I see Shali Kumar from the Republican Hindu Coalition getting back, working more closely with President Trump. And so I think we're going to see, I'm just kind of tipping folks off, I think here towards the end of 2022, the next 2 years, we're going to be in full campaign mode for 2024. And President Trump is making a specific effort to reach, Indian Americans and really Hindu Americans. And we'll see. I don't know if that outreach is the same for the Chinese community, the Vietnamese community. Obviously, China is not at the same level as it was pre-2020. I listened to the Ohio Senate debate between Congressman Ryan and J.D. Vance. And both candidates were bashing China openly to an Ohio audience. So I didn't hear many Democrats bash China too openly 2 to 3 years ago, but you're hearing it now. I deal with the FCC a lot, and I see both Chairman Ajit Pai, who is a Republican, and the chairwoman now, Jessica Rosenworcel, both saying, hey, we cannot subsidize Chinese technology for FCC appropriated equipment. And so this is a sea change. It was a free-for-all 5 years ago, and that's really changed. So we'll see how this thing impacts. I think it's too early to say, but if you're ignoring the Asian American community in 2024, you're making a huge mistake. That's for sure. And we've done a lot of political coverage running up to the midterms, which I think we're going to talk about next. Is there are, I think, both major political parties are now starting to make specific outreach, and Trump did that in 2016, forced the Democrats to do something in 2020, which they did. They had a specific virtual event hosted by now Vice President Kamala Harris. And we have some of these things in the archives. If you check out the Diya TV YouTube channel, we have all this content that came out in 2020, but it was different because of COVID. Everything was virtual. We didn't go to a physical RNC or a physical DNC. And so we'll see what 2024 is like. I would imagine we're going to be back in person, and that kind of thing is going to change the dynamic in a couple of years from now. So
yeah, and I think what we're going to start to see more of, and it's already begun, is the fact that each party, Democrat or Republicans, they're not going to see us all as a monolith anymore, right? The Chinese aren't the same as the Japanese aren't the same as the Koreans aren't the same as the Vietnamese, and the Indians aren't the same as the Pakistanis and the Sri Lankans, and so on and so forth. So what you're going to start to see, I feel like, and we're already seeing, is that the Indian American, the Hindu American voting bloc has really started to take center stage and has emerged. Look, we know all the statistics, right? Indian Americans, the most educated, college educated, the most affluent, Asian American group. So I think it's really interesting what's going to happen now. But that also shows you not only the maturity and the immigration patterns in America among Asian Americans. What you're starting to see is also now this identity crisis. And I think what's going to be really interesting is for Republicans and Democrats is they're going to have to start figuring out how to cater to these specific groups. And I think that's a good thing, because they're no longer hopefully going to take Asian Americans and now Indian Americans and South Asians for granted. They're not going to see us as all the same, because now the folks in those communities are refusing to be put underneath that same umbrella. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know there's a lot of Desi pride in the communities as well. And from a political standpoint, I know a lot of Indian Americans who say, I'm not the same as a Chinese American. I'm not the same as a Japanese American. In fact, they don't even want to be called Asian Americans, let alone South Asians, right? Who came up with these phrases and terms anyways, right?
Right. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of stuff from the past that have been kind of pushed on minority communities. But I will say this. So I live in a majority Asian American county, which is absurd to think about, considering when we were both growing up, we were distinct minorities, right? Maybe the only Korean American in your case. I was certainly one of the only Indian Americans, and in my case, at the schools that I went to.
And we heard every single racist name under the sun, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we can
every
share
stereotype.
That. We can share that in the uncensored version of the show. But I think that's where, to see the sea change, 30, 40 years later, and seeing so much diversity, it's telling. And I'll give a couple of examples. And I do want to get into some other topics beyond our interaction with President Trump. There is a very contentious mayoral race in San Jose and Santa Clara. We're intimately involved in covering these races because it's in the heart of Silicon Valley, and our network emanates from Silicon Valley. And the San Jose mayoral candidates, both of them are making like specific outreach to the Vietnamese community, which is a community I cover quite heavily because on the television station that we operate in the Bay Area, there's a very powerful Vietnamese channel, and there's 350,000 Vietnamese in the South Bay. Many of them reside in San Jose proper, and so in all likelihood, there will be it's being negotiated right now, a debate specifically targeting the Vietnamese community. I mean, this was unheard of 10 years ago, right? But you think about now the base of the Vietnamese community, the Chinese community in the Bay Area has 1 million people. The Indian community has roughly 500,000 in the Bay Area. So you're going to see these subgroups, and that's going to trickle down to the local level. So that if you're ignoring minority groups on the local level, you're going to get burned. Certainly statewide, we saw a lot of outreach. I know the state of California, they've been doing a lot of stuff towards reaching AAPI communities. And in part, we're going to discuss this later. Part of the reason the show came about is thanks to support from the state of California, because they're seeing the inequity and the lack of dollars expended towards what is a very large community that's been marginalized for a long time. So we're going to see more specific outreach all over the place. And certainly, I think both political parties are jumping into it. And then historically, the Democrats, going to the DNC, you see this like unbelievable diversity. You don't quite see that at the RNC, at least the 2016 edition that I saw. But I think certainly you're going to have more and more outreach. And I think both parties need to do that. And it actually leads me to what I wanted to discuss with you next, Jonathan, is, I had a chance to talk to Senator Joe Manchin, who has become like, certainly I would say maybe a top 5 political leader in Washington. I mean, outside of, say, Pelosi and McConnell and certainly the president and the vice president, Senator Joe Manchin has a lot of juice in Washington. It's because, in many respects, he's kind of the swing vote, in a 50-50 Senate that, he votes with the Democrats. They have a chance to at least have an opportunity to have a simple majority with a vote from Vice President Harris. And so because of his background, and for those of you that are unaware, he is the senator from West Virginia. There's me having a chance to talk to him after this event. And this event was a 75th anniversary celebration of India, post partition and post independence, there as a free nation. And so there's all these Indian Americans from the diaspora that have done incredibly well. And what's fascinating, a story that I really haven't covered extensively, which I frankly need to, is that there's a very large contingent of Indian Americans in West Virginia. And Senator Manchin recognized that. In fact, his personal physician is Indian American, called him up and said, hey, can you speak at this event where there was just a large group of Indian American doctors on hand? And of course, if you know the numbers, I believe the number is something like 125,000 Indian American doctors that are represented by this organization called AAPI, which is also kind of an AAPI acronym. And so Senator Manchin was there. A number of other senators and Congress members were there. And I've gone to an AAPI conference in person a few times. And, you know, when you want to see, back when Senator Harry Reid was running things, he would show up to the AAPI conference. The new congresswoman at the time from Hawaii, Tulsi Gabbard, she was there to make the rounds because, let's face it, these doctors have, you know, a very sizable wallet and an opportunity to get, you know, financial support, and overall, these are influencers in the community. And so it was kind of astounding to see Senator Manchin there, you know, coming to this event, trying to speak specifically to not just the medical community, but Indian Americans in West Virginia. And he flat out said, and we have this full speech if you want to see it on our YouTube platform, he basically said that we would not have legitimate healthcare in West Virginia without the Indian American community. Like, I can't even imagine a better compliment than talking about the impact that Indian Americans have had in West Virginia, which, I mean, let's face it, I didn't realize the magnitude and the growth until a few years ago, because we thought, hey, we'll have these coastal cities where we get a chance to broadcast from. But, you know, one of our strongest venues happens to be in Indiana now. Indianapolis has, in that whole region, has a huge Indian American base, and we're seeing it in Florida now. We're seeing it in the Carolinas, and certainly West Virginia, another venue I never thought would have a large group of folks from India living there. That's clearly the case, according to Senator Manchin. So really eye-opening to be there in his presence and to see the respect that he's had. And I think this is where, getting back to what you were saying, Jonathan, both parties are recognizing the diversity. And for those folks that are willing to open up their wallets a little bit, was, let's face it, that's also part of the reason they're meeting with these people, because some of these people do write a check. And that's also part of the calculus.
Yeah, you know, obviously, we are both Asian Americans. You're Indian American, I'm Korean American. And I think race and ethnicity obviously are important and will play a role. But I think really what we're going to see moving forward, especially in politics, is not just, you know, going after the quote unquote Asian American voting bloc. I think what we're really starting to see is that Asian Americans, again, are not a monolith. We don't think all the same. You know, we don't all like rice or curry or every other stereotype, or eat sushi, or know martial arts, or, you know, play the bhangra drums. Have I pretty much offended you yet? Or, you know, what other stereotypes are out there? I think what we're really starting to now see, especially, and I think where Democrats have been shocked and will continue to be shocked, is that they took Asian Americans, Indian Americans for granted for so long. They just assumed, hey, we're the party about diversity. We want to fight for social justice. But now you have a lot of Asian Americans who used to vote Democrat saying, wait a second, where's our social justice? Is the Democratic Party really what's best for our interests? And the answer is starting to resoundingly become no, maybe not. Because as you know, and this is probably for another podcast, and we're going to have many more opportunities at this, is that Asian Americans are now, you know, many of them are doing well in areas like academia and science, medicine, especially technology, to the point where we're now being discriminated against, right? That whole model minority myth, it is a myth because many Asian Americans still don't speak English, are immigrants in this country, and they are not all doctors and lawyers and successful. And I know many of them in Seattle's Chinatown, many of them in San Francisco and New York and Chicago's Chinatowns, who are just scraping by, collecting cans on the streets just to make it. Don't even speak English, need to go to the local food pantry to get by. They're Asian Americans. Okay, so again, this wide spectrum. But again, I think what I'm starting to see, at least here in Seattle, in this one-party state, which is definitely starting to lean more progressive Democrat, Asian Americans, the big controversy that I'm covering out here in Seattle is that There's this massive homeless megaplex being dumped into a neighborhood just a block away from the historic Chinatown International District. And once again, the narrative is you've got this big bad Democrat white politician named Dow Constantine, the executive of King County, essentially trying to fast track and ram this project through so he can get a win, essentially. And no doubt, I believe he wants to do what's best to combat the homeless crisis, but it's coming on the shoulders of this marginalized community on the Chinatown International District, which, again, the vast majority are 70 to 80-year-olds, the ones who actually live there and work there. They're senior citizens who don't speak English. There are multiple languages there, and there's has not been this outreach. So we're really starting to see this showdown. And I think a lot of Democrats, unfortunately, as well as Republicans in the past, they've kind of written off Asian Americans. So when it comes to controversies like this, there's definitely a political equation to it, like a risk assessment, right? So is it more risky not to put in a homeless shelter to help all these homeless people because all these Democrats and progressive far left activists want housing for the homeless? Or can I, take my chances and really piss off the Asian Americans? Because in the past, Asian Americans have been known as this community that's just not fought or spoken up. So it's really interesting. So again, more so than race and ethnicity, I'm starting to realize even within these groups, you're starting to see a values, system emerge and differences there, and then also ideology. So I think that's going to be an interesting narrative and debate, and something that I think a journalist, especially Asian American journalists, really need to cover moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a shift, and I think we've seen it. Indian Americans largely have voted for Democrats, roughly about 80%. We saw President Trump chip away a little bit in 2016. 2020, Biden was able to pull a lot of this back. Obviously, Kamala Harris helped having an Indian American woman on the ticket. And now we'll see if techniques will change in 2024. And I should mention before, just presuming President Trump will be the nominee for the GOP, I'm also hearing rumblings that, the GOP is also, have a plan B, so to speak. And so that also could be in the offing. And I know we will likely talk about that in the weeks ahead. But, we don't even know where this thing's all going to shake out, certainly with President Trump's legal matters as well. Obviously, this is our first broadcast, and we've had a lot to get into. And I still wanted to touch a couple of bases. We want to actually have a segment on this program on a regular basis talking about AAPI hate crimes. And unfortunately, it's something that we do want to spotlight. And this segment's sponsored by the state of California through the California Public Library System. They facilitated this broadcast to be able to talk about this rampant issue of hate crimes. I know Jonathan and I have both seen this for a couple of years during COVID, but it continues to persist. Most recently, and I don't know if this particular crime has been classified as a hate crime, but certainly it was a heinous crime that we just covered, where a family of four, it was a husband, a wife, their baby girl of like 8 months, and an uncle. They were all slain outside of Sacramento, California, in the Central Valley, in the Merced area, by seemingly it looks like a former colleague, someone who used to work for them. And these kind of stories, which, let's face it, you didn't really hear about too much in the past. Now, because the community's gotten so large, we are hearing more and more about these incidents. And obviously, in the last couple of months, we've covered some really unbelievable situations where we had a man, hurling all kinds of epithets, specifically at a Hindu American man. This man appears to be of Sikh heritage, and he was ranting and raving at a Taco Bell in Fremont, California, and he got charged with a hate crime for this rant, which went viral on the internet. And a Hindu American man was just standing there at a Taco Bell, just taking this abuse. And then we had 4 Indian American women in Plano, Texas, getting yelled at by a Mexican American woman in Texas. So it's been pretty wild of late, and this seems to happen virtually every week, if not every few days, Jonathan.
Yeah, and not to mention the ongoing Asian hate and the targeting that's happening to a lot of seniors and women, right, who are Asian Americans, Indian Americans, Sikhs, so on and so forth. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, and we have to call it what it is, the perpetrators are either black or brown. The video don't lie, and that dynamic needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, the mainstream media has just not done a fair and accurate job of, again, not just talking about that dynamic, but just overall, even covering these stories right now. I mean, it really has become a cottage industry covering Asian hate, and we have some colleagues, all over the country, in the Bay Area, in New York City, in Philadelphia, in Boston, Chicago, covering these ongoing issues, and of course here in Seattle as well. I'm still here doing that. It seems like at least 1 or 2 a month, but man, the stuff that's coming out, especially New York and San Francisco. At the same time, what's really been heartening and a positive is we saw the power of the Asian American voting bloc. Former San Francisco District Attorney Choe was recalled just earlier this year, and the Asian American community orchestrated that, played a huge role, because the inconvenient truth was that Choe branded himself a progressive, but he wasn't prosecuting any of the perpetrators, because the vast majority of the perpetrators, unfortunately, were black, and those optics just did not sit well for the Asian American community. Many of the leaders saying, you care more, again, about other minority groups, about the criminals. Where's our social justice? So again, we saw what happened, and I think a message was sent to other elected officials and DAs and people in the criminal justice system. No doubt there needs to be reform, but look, you can't do it at the expense of Asian American seniors and women who are getting beat up just because of what they look like, and because of this Asian hate culture that unfortunately I think is here to stay.
Well, I mean, this particular inaugural broadcast is one where we wanted to, just get folks to know us a little bit, some of the stuff that we cover, and certainly keeping an eye on these hate crimes is going to be part of our beat. I was really happy to get a chance to actually ask President Trump about that, as well as all these political leaders that we talk to on a regular basis that have to address this. And certainly I think the angle that you have in Seattle, where a homeless, a very large scale homeless shelter will likely be placed right in the heart of Chinatown. I mean, that is certainly going to be something to keep an eye on. And I know it's been a heated point of controversy in Seattle. I'm really glad you've actually been holding these guys accountable, because let's face it, had you not been out there sticking your neck out, certainly I don't think the community would have mobilized to this degree.
Yeah, and for those of you not watching Seattle local media, I mean, it's fractured. It is. I'm watching the beginning of the end, it feels like, in the beginning, unfortunately. And I didn't want to be the only one. I was asking my colleagues behind the scenes, why aren't you guys covering this, Chinatown International District, controversy with this homeless mega shelter? And they're like, look, we just don't have the resources. Look, my managers just right now don't care. They don't think it's a big deal. So I just kept pounding that story, and, one thing led to another. And now the mainstream media here is finally on the story. But I think for the Chinatown International District, it's too little too late. And for the politicians, and I've said this time and time again, especially in the past year, these public relations teams now hired by these politicians, they're so robust. They're made up of former journalists in many cases, right, who've left the industry for more money, joining the city or county now with pensions and so on and so forth. So local media, these kids, they're outgunned by these politicians that have these robust PR teams. So it really is a sad state of affairs, especially when it comes to these communities now. And for the politicians, they're going to get away with a lot more. That's my prediction moving forward.
I mean, that's very accurate. We're kind of outgunned 10-1, actual reporters versus PR folks. And that's what people don't realize. And you're right. I mean, the profession is becoming younger and younger, and the veterans at some point, another colleague of ours just left the business the other day. And you're like, not a surprise he hung in there that long. But unless you're really passionate about it and have the wherewithal to find a way to make a living, it's become a very increasingly difficult to stay in the business. And even legendary radio stations, I was part of one called KGO Radio, 80 years serving the Bay Area. They went to a sports gambling format this week.
Because who has the money? The online gambling companies now, right? Like the DraftKings and the Golden Nuggets and so on and so forth. You got to follow the money, and the tech companies, like I said earlier, the gambling companies now, they're synonymous. They go hand in hand. That they're going to be fueling the content.
Right. Well, Jonathan, pleasure to have you in this format. Our conversations no longer have to stay private. We can have some public ones here. And I appreciate you doing this, and it should be a lot of fun. And, you know, we'll definitely get into some of the heavier topics, and there's so much stuff going on in the world, but especially from our footholds, you know, covering things nationally, and Jonathan's in the trenches in Seattle, but I know you'll be springing all over the country as well, which I'm looking forward to seeing what you uncover, because you're on a heck of a beat. So appreciate the time. Glad we got this first one, you know, under our belt here. Protected speech. Obviously, like, share, subscribe, follow us on all these different channels. And of course, you can watch us on television as well, which is another interesting part of this program that folks all over America can just tune in and watch us across the nation. So thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll see you again next week.
We've been unleashed.